Well, for more on the international reaction to the latest atrocity in Syria, the massacre of civilians in the town of Houla, let's speak with Jonathan Spire. Dr. Spire is a Middle East author, analyst and journalist. He worked as an advisor to Israeli cabinet ministers. These days, he's a senior research fellow at the Centre for Global Research in International Affairs in Israel. And Dr. Jonathan Spire joins us live from our Canberra studio. Dr. Spire, thanks very much for your time tonight.
Sure, good evening.
What hope do you think Kofi Annan has of bringing about developments at this stage with these talks he's holding in Damascus, given his peace plan has effectively failed?
Yeah, I think unfortunately very little hope at all. The fact of the matter is that the Kofi Annan six-point peace plan was in fact to a great extent doomed from the very start. It was never really implemented. Certain clauses, such as that of removing the army and armour from the urban centres of Syria and allowing journalists free access to the country, were never implemented. 250 UN observers never really had a chance of making a difference or an impact on what's taking place in Syria. So I think the Annan peace plan was doomed from the start. I don't think Kofi Annan really has any other means to bring to the table to try and bring about change in Syria. So I think there's very little chance of anything at all, frankly, coming out of the current moves that are underway involving him. Was
it doomed purely on account of numbers of those there sent to enforce it, or was there not enough tough talk, tough attitude from the international community to follow through and to enforce what was put in place there?
Yeah, I think that the latter, from what you said, is in fact the case. You know, there was never a chance that the Syrian regime would alter its behaviour as a result of the imposition of a few hundred, or had it even been a few thousand unarmed UN observers. That just isn't the kind of mechanism that's going to force this regime, which regards itself correctly as fighting for its life against a popular uprising intended to bring it down, to change its behaviour. It's not going to simply take its own decision and change its way of behaviour. It will change only when and if it is coerced to do so, I think, at this stage.
On more than one occasion in the past 15 or so months, there have been seemingly watershed moments where it would seem as though the world would be forced to act on the Syrian conflict. How likely is it that the Houla massacre will really and finally bring about international action?
Well, one hopes so, but I'm afraid I'm not holding my breath, and I'll tell you why. Because many of the factors which have served to prevent action in the past are still in evidence today. It's important to remember that the Houla massacre was not the first of its kind. 11,000 people at least have died in the course of the Syrian uprising, and many of them were killed, as those of us who look at Syria closely know, many of them were killed in ways no less cruel and no less heinous than the Houla massacre was, and yet this did not bring about a real international intervention or real moves to try to bring down the regime of Assad and change the situation. And that is because Assad has a real international coalition behind him. He's got the Russians behind him, he's got the Iranians behind him, he's got Hezbollah behind him. If you take on Assad, you're taking on a very determined, very brutal dictator with some very powerful international forces behind him. And the fact of the matter is that the West and the international community, up until now at least, simply don't seem to have had a stomach for that fight. I'm not quite convinced, although I'd like to be, that that's starting to change. If it does not change, and it seems to not be changing, then I think we'll see the same results right now as we've seen for the last 14 months, namely lots of verbiage, lots of calls for change in Syria, lots of calls for the dictator Assad to step down, but nothing really much substantive beyond that.
So when we see, for example, today the Australian Foreign Minister announcing the expulsion of 2 Syrian diplomats here, we've just heard President Hollande do something similar in France. Our Foreign Minister says other countries are going to be following suit. So in light of what you've said, what effect, if any, is this going to have on Damascus?
Well, this is good stuff. I mean, in the sense that this is an advancement on what existed before. There are, of course, also existing sanctions, and quite heinous sanctions, in place against the Syrian regime as a result of its activities over the last 14 months. And these are having a real and tangible impact on the Syrian economy and on the ability of the regime and its elite to function in a way that they'd like to. But that's not really the question. You can impact on them, and expelling diplomats is a good way to try to impact. But this regime regards itself as fighting for its life, and it's fighting for its life as it sees it by all means necessary. So if one considers that's where this regime is at, then one answers one's own question, I think. What effect will expelling a charge d'affaires have, welcome though that may well be, on a regime, on a dictatorial regime, which is fighting for its life as it sees itself? The answer is close to none, I think. It's going to take much, much more than this.
Talking of much, much more, folks often compare last year the situation in Libya with what's going on now. Now, they say last year the world saw an international coalition act against the Gaddafi regime with the aim ostensibly of protecting civilians. In light of what we're seeing coming out of Syria and Houla being the latest example of what's happening to civilians there, given all of that and how much longer the conflict has been going on in Syria compared to Libya and the rising civilian death toll, how great is the pressure now for the UN Security Council to act more decisively and even perhaps put boots on the ground?
Well, let's remember that Libya, there was an advantage vis-à-vis Libya in that the Gaddafi regime in Libya was internationally isolated. Gaddafi didn't really have any friends at all, not among his fellow Arab states and not among states outside of the Arab world. So when the United Nations Security Council chose to act against him, it was able to do so with a degree of unity. What's happened so far, however, is that President Bashar Assad has two very good friends on the United Nations Security Council, Russia and China. One of those countries, Russia, in fact, underwrites his survival by the energetic provision of arms to the regime going on to this very day, and it's been going on for the last 14 months. And it's been the Russians who have prevented any real action through the United Nations Security Council. So the key question, I think, on everybody's mind right now is the Russian stance shifting? If the Russians shift their stance, if they decide that this dictator and his survival has become no longer a feasible or desirable goal for them, then things could really begin to shift in the Security Council and elsewhere. But if they haven't, and there isn't as yet any concrete indication that they have, if they haven't, then the Russians will continue blocking action through the Security Council, and therefore it will continue not to happen. The Russians are a permanent member of the UNSC, and they have that veto power. So
you saw no shifting of ground given today by the Russian Foreign Minister Lavrov in his talks with his counterpart, British counterpart, Haig?
Well, we saw that Lavrov made quite a strange statement with regard to the killings in Houla. He said that, well, the regime may well partially be responsible, but the rebels also are partially responsible, or some such formula as that. You know, there's no evidence whatsoever that any of that is right. That is, in fact, in a certain degree, echoing the claims of the regime itself. So if the Foreign Minister of Russia is still echoing the claims of the Assad regime, this doesn't seem to be a particularly good portent for hoping that things are about to shift in the Russian attitude. We're told that Dmitry Medvedev, Prime Minister Medvedev, did make some positive-sounding remarks suggesting by President Obama for a Yemen-type model in which Assad would stand down and a process towards elections would begin. Of course, the decision-maker in Russia is President Putin, and we wait to see if he chooses to share some of that sentiment. I'm not holding my breath, I'm afraid, in that regard.
Dr. Spire, you've recently been into Syria. You got across the border, went in there, and you went, as you wrote in your article, to gain an impression of the Free Syrian Army. What conclusions did you arrive at about who they are, who's backing them, and what their ultimate goals are?
Well, I drew the conclusion this was, to a great extent, a very brave and determined group of men. Some of them are our recent army deserters. Others of them are Syrian civilians who've simply decided to take up arms against the regime. But despite their clear courage and determination, I also saw some very clear, or equally clear, limitations in their abilities. First of all, with regard to weaponry, this was an insurgent army armed almost only with light weaponry, AK-47 rifles, some RPG-7s, some heavy machine guns, nothing like the kind of ordnance which it would be necessary to take on Assad's very strong army with its armour, with its artillery, with its air power. This is first of all. And secondly, I saw that there is no real chain of command, no unified chain of command yet in the Free Syrian Army. What there is, rather, is a kind of conglomeration of local armed initiatives, many of which act according to their own particular desires, their own particular interests, sometimes against the interests of neighbouring factions. So until that armed element can match its undoubted courage and determination with firstly high caliber modern weaponry, and secondly a much better centralised chain of command, I don't think it's going to have much of a chance of posing a serious threat to Bashar Assad. So I hope that those two factors can begin to be brought into play in the period ahead.
Jonathan Spire, if the Assad regime does fall, what do you foresee for not just Syria, but also for its neighbours, including where you're from, Israel?
Yes, well, if the Assad regime falls, that will constitute a very heavy blow to the Iran-led regional bloc of which it forms a part in general, and most importantly perhaps to the member of the Iran-led regional bloc in its neighbouring country in Lebanon, namely the Hezbollah organisation, because that organisation depends on Syria as a conduit from which is brought to it the Iranian arms and weaponry and means on which it depends for its survival. So if Assad were to fall, that would cease to be the case. That big neighbour would no longer be there for Hezbollah. The main, or in fact the only Arab state client of Iran, the Assad regime itself, would no longer exist. So it would be a very serious blow to a very powerful enemy to Israel and the West in the region, namely the Iran-led, largely Shia regional bloc. And I think that's probably, strategically speaking, the most significant fallout which would come from the fall of the Assad regime, which means, in my opinion, that in addition to the undoubted moral and ethical reasons to hope for the fall of this regime, there's also a very clear and concrete strategic reason to hope for it, which doubles, I suppose, to some extent, the need for that regime to fall as soon as possible, I think.
Dr. Jonathan Spire, joining us tonight from Canberra, thank you very much for your time and your perspective.
Thanks very much.